journey of Ibn Battuta, the traveller and the horizon. Across the long history of the world, most people have lived their lives close to home. They grow up surrounded by familiar streets, familiar voices, and landscapes that rarely change from one year to the next. The rhythm of daily life unfolds within the boundaries of places they know well. The market in the center of town, the road that leads to neighboring villages, the fields, rivers, or hills that shape the horizon. For many people, the world feels complete within those familiar borders. But every so often, someone appears who begins to wonder what lies beyond them. They hear stories carried by travelers arriving from distant lands. They listen to merchants describing markets far across deserts or seas. They imagine cities whose languages, buildings, and customs are very different from their own. And slowly, the idea of the road begins to take shape in their imagination. To such travelers, the horizon does not feel like the end of the world. Instead, it feels like an invitation. Long before modern maps and airplanes connected continents, the medieval world was already linked together by an intricate network of roads, caravan routes, rivers, and sea lanes. Across North Africa and the Middle East, caravans move steadily between cities carrying silk, spices, salt, manuscripts, and precious metals. Pilgrims walked enormous distances towards sacred destinations, sometimes traveling for months or even years to reach the places they believed would bring them closer to their faith. Scholars traveled between centers of learning, seeking teachers who could share knowledge preserved in distant cities. And merchants sailed across wide oceans, guided by the winds and the stars, linking ports thousands of kilometers apart. Through these journeys, stories, ideas, and traditions slowly spread across continents. It was a world connected not by machines or technology, but by patience, curiosity, and the courage to step beyond the familiar. Among the many travelers who followed these roads, one journey would become especially remarkable. In the early 14th century, a young scholar living in the coastal city of Tangier, on the edge of North Africa, made a decision that would change the course of his life. He planned to travel eastward to perform the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. At the time, the journey seemed simple enough. Travel across North Africa, join the caravan routes of the Middle East, reach the holy city, complete the pilgrimage, and eventually return home. But the road has a way of leading travelers much further than they expect. The pilgrimage that began as a single journey would slowly grow into an exploration lasting nearly 30 years. Over time, this traveler would cross deserts and mountains, sail across oceans, visit royal courts, and witness cultures stretching across Africa, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and China. His name was Ibn Battuta, and the story of his travels would become one of the longest and most extraordinary journeys ever recorded. So tonight, as the world around you grows quiet, settle in and relax as we follow the roads of the medieval world. We will travel beside caravans, crossing desert sands, walk through markets filled with voices from distant lands, and sail across oceans where ships once followed the steady rhythm of the wind. Because sometimes a single step beyond the horizon can lead to a lifetime of discovery. And once the road begins, it has a way of carrying the traveler further than they ever imagined. Before we begin our journey tonight, welcome to Dreamy Night Facts, a place where history becomes a calm and relaxing story. Here on the channel, we explore the lives of remarkable travelers, the rise and fall of ancient cities, the great trade routes that once connected distant cultures, and the quiet moments that shaped our shared human past. Each episode is designed to move slowly and gently, allowing you to listen, learn, and unwind as we travel through history together. If you enjoy peaceful historical journeys like this one, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps the channel grow and allows more people to discover these calm explorations of the past. And if there's a historical place, person, or mystery you'd like to hear about in a future episode, feel free to share your ideas in the comments. Now, find a comfortable place to relax, settle in for the evening, and let the story begin. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary journey of a traveler who crossed deserts, oceans, and continents in search of knowledge and experience. Now take a moment to settle in and relax. Let the pace of the day slowly fade into the background. There's no need to rush anywhere tonight. Perhaps you're listening as you prepare to sleep, or simply resting while the quiet story unfolds. Wherever you are, allow your breathing to slow and your thoughts to drift gently, like a traveler pausing beside the road before a long journey. The world of tonight's story lies many centuries in the past, a time of desert caravans, distant cities, and long roads stretching toward the horizon. So get comfortable, relax, and let your imagination wander as we step back into the medieval world. Our journey begins in the coastal city of Tangier, where a young scholar is about to take his first step onto the road. His name was Ibn Battuta, and his journey began in the coastal city of Tangier, on the edge of North Africa. Now take a moment to settle in and relax. Let the pace of the day slowly fade into the background. There's no need to rush anywhere tonight. Perhaps you're listening as you prepare to sleep, or simply resting while the quiet story unfolds. Wherever you are, allow your breathing to slow and your thoughts to drift gently, like a traveler pausing beside the road before a long journey. The world of tonight's story lies many centuries in the past, a time of desert caravans, distant cities, and long roads stretching toward the horizon. So get comfortable, relax, and let your imagination wander as we step back into the medieval world. Our journey begins in the coastal city of Tangier, where a young scholar is about to take his first step onto the road. Tangier and the edge of the known world. In the early years of the 14th century, on the northern edge of the African continent, stood the coastal city of Tangier. The city faced the narrow stretch of water where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Mediterranean Sea. From its shores, on a clear day, travelers could look northward across the water toward the mountains of southern Spain. Tangier had long been a place where worlds met. Ships arrived from the ports of the Mediterranean carrying merchants, sailors and travelers who had crossed great distances. Caravans arrived from inland North Africa, bringing goods carried across dusty roads and desert trails. The streets of the city were filled with the sounds of trade and conversation. Market stalls displayed woven wool, leather goods, olives, figs, and spices carried from distant lands. Sailors unloaded cargo from ships while traders negotiated prices in shaded courtyards. The population of Tangier reflected the long history of North Africa itself. Most of the people were Muslim, following the teachings of Islam that had spread across the region centuries earlier. The language of religion and scholarship was Arabic, yet many families also spoke Berber languages, the ancient tongues of the indigenous peoples of the region. In the mosques of the city, scholars taught students the principles of Islamic law, theology, and literature. Among those students was a young man named Ibn Battuta. He had been born in Tangier in the year 1304 into a respected family of legal scholars. For generations, the men of his family had served as qadis, judges who interpreted Islamic law and helped resolve disputes within their communities. From an early age, Ibn Battuta was expected to follow the same path. He studied the Quran, memorizing its verses and learning the traditions that guided religious life. He studied Arabic grammar and the writings of earlier scholars who had shaped Islamic legal thought. His world, at that time, seemed centered on the familiar streets of Tangier. But beyond those streets stretched a much larger world. Travelers passing through the city brought stories of distant places, cities of enormous size, markets filled with goods from across continents, and centers of learning where scholars debated philosophy and law late into the night. Many of these travelers spoke of Mecca, the holy city of Islam. For Muslims, the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, was one of the most sacred experiences a believer could undertake. Each year, thousands of pilgrims from across the Islamic world began the long journey toward that distant city. Some traveled from North Africa, others came from Persia, Central Asia, India, and even from lands further east. For a young scholar like Ibn Battuta, the idea of undertaking the pilgrimage carried both spiritual meaning and the promise of adventure. In the year 1325, when he was just 21 years old, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would travel to Mecca. The journey was expected to take more than a year. After completing the pilgrimage, he would return home. At least, that was the plan. But the road has a way of reshaping the intentions of those who step onto it. The first roads of North Africa. When Ibn Battuta left Tangier, he did not travel alone. Across North Africa, travelers usually join caravans that move together along established routes. These caravans included merchants transporting goods, pilgrims traveling toward Mecca, scholars moving between centers of learning, and ordinary travelers seeking opportunity in distant cities. Together, they formed moving communities on the road. The journey eastward carried Ibn Battuta across the lands known as the Maghreb, a region stretching across modern Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. The landscapes of the Maghreb were varied. In some areas, the road passed through fertile valleys where farmers cultivated wheat and olives. In other places, the land grew dry and rocky, with distant hills rising beneath wide skies. Villages appeared at intervals along the road. Many of these settlements had grown up around wells or springs where caravans could stop to rest and replenish their water supplies. One of the important cities along this route was Tlemcen, located in present-day Algeria. Tlemcen had long been known as a center of learning and trade. Its mosques attracted scholars who taught Islamic law and theology, while its markets bustled with merchants selling wool garments, leather goods, and spices carried from distant ports. For travelers, cities like Tlemcen offered more than commerce. They offered hospitality. In the Islamic world, welcoming travelers was considered an important virtue. Pilgrims and scholars arriving from distant lands were often offered food, lodging, and the opportunity to join discussions in mosques and schools. Further east along the coast lay the city of Tunis. Tunis was larger and busier than many of the towns Ibn Battuta had seen so far. The city stood near the Mediterranean Sea, and ships arriving at its harbor carried goods from across the region. The markets of Tunis were filled with merchants selling olive oil, grain, woven cloth, and fine ceramics. The streets echoed with conversations in Arabic, though travelers could also hear the Berber dialects spoken by people from rural communities. For Ibn Battuta, these early stages of the journey revealed something important. The world was not divided into isolated cities. Instead, it was connected by networks of roads, trade, and learning. The caravan routes carried not only goods, but also ideas. Travelers shared stories about distant lands. Scholars exchanged teachings that had traveled thousands of kilometers. Slowly, step by step, the young traveler from Tangier was beginning to understand that the world was far larger than he had imagined. And as the road continues onward, the world slowly begins to change. New landscapes appear beyond the horizon, and the traveler moves quietly toward the next stage of the journey. And the road ahead would soon bring him to one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, the city of Cairo. The Valley of the Nile. After many weeks of travel across the cities and roads of North Africa, Ibn Battuta's journey eventually carried him toward a land unlike any he had seen before. Egypt had long been known as one of the great centers of civilization in the world. For thousands of years, the region had been shaped by the steady waters of the Nile River, whose annual floods transformed the surrounding land into a ribbon of fertile green stretching across the desert. As the young traveler approached the region, the landscape began to change. The dry plains of North Africa gradually gave way to fields where farmers worked the soil beside irrigation channels that guided water from the Nile. Villages appeared more frequently along the roads, their houses built from sun-baked brick and surrounded by groves of date palms. Life in Egypt followed a rhythm closely tied to the river. Each year the Nile rose and spilled across the land, leaving behind rich soil where crops could grow in abundance. Wheat, barley, vegetables, and fruit filled the markets of the region, supporting a large and prosperous population. At the heart of this landscape stood the city of Cairo. By the 14th century, Cairo had grown into one of the largest cities on earth. It served as the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a powerful state that controlled Egypt, Syria, and important trade routes linking Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. For a traveler arriving from distant lands, Cairo could feel overwhelming. The city stretched across the eastern bank of the Nile in a maze of narrow streets and crowded markets. Minarets rose above the rooftops of mosques, and the call to prayer echoed across the city 5 times each day. Merchants filled the markets with goods gathered from across the known world. Traders sold pepper and cinnamon from India, silk from China, and gold brought north across the Sahara from West Africa. Artisans produced finely worked metal lamps, glass vessels, and textiles woven with intricate designs. The streets were filled with movement. Water carriers passed through the markets with leather bags slung over their shoulders. Scholars walked toward mosques where lessons were held beneath shaded arcades. Sailors unloaded cargo from boats arriving along the Nile. In Cairo, Ibn Battuta also encountered one of the most important centers of Islamic learning, Al-Azhar mosque. Here scholars gathered to teach theology, law, grammar, and philosophy. Students from across the Islamic world came to study under respected teachers, forming circles of discussion beneath the mosque's arches. For the young traveler from Tangier, Cairo revealed the extraordinary scale of the world beyond his homeland. And yet, even in this vast and lively city, he had not yet reached his destination. The pilgrimage to Mecca still lay ahead. But first, the road would carry him north, toward the ancient city of Damascus. Damascus and the gardens of Syria. Leaving Cairo behind, Ibn Battuta joined travelers moving north across the eastern Mediterranean lands. The road carried him through the Sinai Peninsula, a rugged region of mountains and desert where travelers moved carefully between wells and resting places. From there, the journey entered the lands of Syria, a region known in the medieval Islamic world as Al-Sham. Compared to the desert landscapes of Sinai, Syria appeared lush and welcoming. Fields of grain spread across the plains. Rivers flowing from distant mountains nourished orchards filled with apricot, fig, and pomegranate trees. Eventually, the road brought Ibn Battuta to Damascus, a city already ancient when many of the world's great empires were still young. Damascus had been inhabited for thousands of years, and by the 14th century, it was one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the Islamic world. Travelers approaching the city often described the remarkable sight of green gardens surrounding the city walls. Water from the Barada River flowed through canals that spread across the plain, allowing farmers to cultivate fruit trees and vegetables in abundance. From a distance, Damascus appeared almost like an oasis of greenery surrounded by dry hills. Inside the city, life unfolded within a network of markets, courtyards, and mosques. Damascus was particularly famous for its textile production. The city produced fine woven fabrics that were traded across the Islamic world and into Europe. The English word damask, used for a type of patterned cloth, even takes its name from this city. Artisans worked patiently in workshops where looms clattered and dyes colored the threads of silk and wool. But Damascus was not only known for its crafts. It was also one of the most important gathering points for the Hajj pilgrimage. Each year, thousands of pilgrims assembled in the city before beginning the long desert journey to Mecca. For weeks before the caravan departed, the streets filled with travelers arriving from many lands. Some came from Anatolia, speaking Turkish. Others arrived from Persia, speaking Persian. Pilgrims from Central Asia brought their own languages and traditions. Arabic served as the common language that allowed these travelers to communicate with one another. caravans loaded with supplies prepared for the journey. Camels carried tents, food and water for the long crossing ahead. For Ibn Battuta, this gathering must have been extraordinary. Thousands of people, all moving toward the same sacred destination. Soon, he would join them, because the road from Damascus to Mecca was about to begin. The caravan to Mecca. When the great pilgrimage caravan finally departed Damascus, it formed a moving city crossing the desert. Thousands of pilgrims traveled together under the guidance of experienced caravan leaders who knew the ancient routes leading south toward the holy cities of Arabia. The caravan stretched across the desert landscape in long lines of camels, horses, and travelers walking beside them. Each day followed a careful rhythm. Before sunrise, the camp would begin to stir. Travelers packed their belongings while the animals were prepared for the road. By early morning, the caravan was moving once again, crossing the open desert under the rising sun. Eventually, after weeks crossing the desert, the caravan reached the mountains surrounding Mecca. There, nestled among rocky hills, stood the city that had drawn travelers across continents. The destination of Ibn Battuta's long journey from Tangier. And yet, strangely enough, his travels were only just beginning. And so the journey continues, one road leading quietly to another, as the traveler moves deeper into a wider world. Beneath the desert stars. Take a moment now to imagine the caravan resting in the quiet desert night. The long journey across the sands has paused for a few hours. Camels kneel beside the tents, their shadows stretching across the pale sand. Small fires glow softly in the darkness, their light flickering gently in the evening air. Around these fires, travelers speak in low voices. Some share food after the long day's journey. Others simply sit in silence, watching the sky slowly fill with stars. Far above the desert, the night sky stretches endlessly in every direction. Without the lights of cities, the stars appear brighter here, scattered across the darkness like distant lanterns. The wind moves quietly across the sand dunes, carrying the faint sound of the desert night. Somewhere beyond the camp, another caravan may be traveling beneath the same sky, their lanterns swaying gently as they move along the ancient road. For centuries, travelers have followed these same paths. Pilgrims seeking sacred places, merchants carrying goods across continents, scholars traveling in search of knowledge. And tonight, beneath the same wide sky, the young traveler from Tangier rests beside the caravan. Tomorrow, the journey will continue. But for now, the desert is quiet, and and the stars watch silently over the road. The sacred city of Mecca. After weeks crossing the desert with the great pilgrimage caravan, the travelers finally reached the mountains surrounding Mecca. Unlike the fertile landscapes of Egypt or Syria, the region around Mecca was rugged and dry. The city lay within a narrow valley surrounded by rocky hills that rose steeply on every side. Yet despite its harsh surroundings, Mecca held a unique place in the hearts of millions of people. At the center of the city stood the great mosque, known as the Masjid al-Haram. Within its courtyard stood the Kaaba, the sacred structure toward which Muslims around the world turn during daily prayers. For centuries, pilgrims had traveled to this place from across the Islamic world. When Ibn Battuta entered the mosque for the first time, he found himself surrounded by travelers from lands he had only heard about before. Pilgrims had arrived from North Africa, Persia, Central Asia, and Anatolia. Others had come from the distant coasts of India, where Muslim communities had grown through centuries of trade and cultural exchange. Pilgrims walked slowly around the Kaaba, circling it 7 times as part of the traditional ceremonies that symbolized unity and devotion. For many pilgrims, this was the first time they had encountered people from such distant parts of the world. Ibn Battuta remained in Mecca for several months after completing the pilgrimage. Yet, as the months passed, a quiet question began to form in the young traveler's mind. Should he return home now that the pilgrimage was complete? Many pilgrims did exactly that. But Ibn Battuta hesitated. He had already traveled so far. And beyond Mecca, other roads continued across the lands of the Middle East. Curiosity began to guide his decision. Instead of turning back toward Morocco, he chose to continue exploring the wider world. The next stage of his journey would carry him toward the ancient lands of Iraq, Baghdad, and the legacy of the Abbasids. Leaving Mecca behind, Ibn Battuta traveled north toward Iraq, a region that had once stood at the heart of one of the most powerful empires in Islamic history. His destination was the city of Baghdad. Centuries earlier, Baghdad had served as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, an empire that had ruled much of the Middle East and beyond. During its golden age, the city had become one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. Although Baghdad had suffered severe damage during the Mongol invasion of 1258, it still remained an important city during Ibn Battuta's lifetime. The city stood beside the Tigris River, whose waters flowed south toward the Persian Gulf. Bridges crossed the river, connecting neighborhoods filled with markets, mosques, and gardens. When Ibn Battuta arrived, he encountered a city that still carried the memory of its former greatness. Scholars continued to teach in its mosques. Merchants traded goods brought from distant regions of Persia, Central Asia, and Anatolia. The streets were filled with traders selling textiles, carpets, spices, and finely crafted metal objects. Baghdad's cultural life reflected the long influence of Persian civilization. Although Arabic remained the language of religion and scholarship, many people also spoke Persian, which had become widely used across the Eastern Islamic world. Persian poetry and literature were highly respected, and gatherings of scholars often included the recitation of famous poems. During his travels through Iraq, Ibn Battuta also visited several smaller cities and religious shrines that were important to the region's spiritual traditions. In these places, he met scholars, mystics, and travelers who had spent their lives studying the deeper dimensions of Islamic thought. These encounters introduced him to communities of Sufi practitioners, Muslims who sought a more personal and contemplative relationship with faith through meditation, poetry, and spiritual discipline. Such experiences added new layers to Ibn Battuta's understanding of the Islamic world. Religion was not practiced in exactly the same way everywhere. Different regions had developed their own traditions and interpretations, shaped by centuries of history and cultural exchange. Yet despite these differences, a shared foundation of belief connected communities across enormous distances. After exploring Iraq, Ibn Battuta continued east into the lands of Persia. The cities of Persia. The journey into Persia, which corresponds largely to modern Iran, carried Ibn Battuta into a region known for its refined culture and long intellectual traditions. Persia had once been the center of powerful empires long before the rise of Islam. Even after becoming part of the Islamic world, the region maintained a strong sense of its own cultural identity. Cities such as Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz were celebrated for their architecture. In the 14th century, Persia was not a single unified kingdom. Instead, it was a patchwork of territories ruled by different dynasties that had emerged after the great Mongol conquests of the previous century. Many cities were still recovering from the devastation caused by those invasions, yet Persian culture remained remarkably resilient. The traveler first moved toward the city of Tabriz, located in the northwest of Persia. Tabriz had grown into one of the most important trading cities of the region. Situated along major caravan routes linking Anatolia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, it attracted merchants from across Eurasia. Markets filled the city with goods that had traveled extraordinary distances. Further south, the traveler reached the celebrated city of Shiraz. Shiraz was known across Persia as a center of literature and learning. It was the home of famous poets such as Saadi, whose writings explored themes of morality, philosophy, and human behavior. In Shiraz, Ibn Battuta observed a society that valued scholarship and artistic expression alongside religious devotion. He also visited several important Sufi shrines, where followers of mystical traditions practice spiritual devotion through reflection, prayer, and poetry. After many months traveling through the region, Ibn Battuta eventually turned south once again. The deserts and mountains of Persia slowly gave way to the coastal lands bordering the Persian Gulf. There he reached the bustling port of Hormuz, one of the most important maritime trading centers of the medieval world. From this harbor, ships sailed across the Indian Ocean toward India, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. For the traveler from Tangier, a new chapter of the journey was about to begin. The roads of Persia had been long and varied, but the sea now offered routes that stretched even further across the world, toward the Indian Ocean. After spending time in the cities of Persia, Ibn Battuta gradually turned his attention southward. Beyond the inland caravan routes lay a different network of travel, one shaped not by desert roads or mountain passes, but by the vast waters of the Indian Ocean. For centuries, merchants and sailors had crossed this ocean using knowledge of the monsoon winds. These winds changed direction at predictable times of the year, allowing ships to travel between Arabia, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Ports along the Arabian coast served as gateways to this maritime world. In cities such as Hormuz, traders gathered goods that would soon be carried across the sea. Ships filled their cargo holds with textiles, spices, metals, and ceramics before setting sail toward distant harbors. When Ibn Battuta boarded one of these vessels, he entered a new phase of his journey. Life aboard a ship followed a quiet rhythm. During the day, the crew adjusted the sails and watched the horizon for changes in weather. Passengers rested on the deck, sharing stories of the lands they had visited. At night, the ocean became calm and reflective, and the stars spread across the sky with remarkable clarity. The ship moved steadily across the water, and ahead lay the busy ports of East Africa. The port of Hormuz. After many months traveling across the cities and landscapes of Persia, Ibn Battuta finally reached the southern coast of the Iranian plateau. There, where the desert meets the sea, stood the remarkable port city of Hormuz. Hormuz was unlike the inland cities he had visited earlier. Instead of caravans arriving across dusty roads, the harbor was filled with ships arriving from distant coasts. Wooden vessels with tall lateen sails rocked gently beside crowded docks, while merchants unloaded cargo from lands far beyond the horizon. The city occupied a strategic position along the Persian Gulf, making it one of the most important commercial gateways between the Middle East and the wider Indian Ocean world. Merchants gathered there from many regions. Traders from Arabia brought dates, pearls, and horses. Ships from India arrived carrying spices, cotton textiles, and precious stones. Sailors from East Africa transported ivory and gold, gathered from inland trade routes. Markets filled with goods that had traveled enormous distances. Bundles of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves lay beside colorful fabrics and carved metal lamps. Ceramic vessels from China appeared beside locally crafted jewelry and delicate glassware. The air of the port carried the scent of salt water mixed with the fragrances of spices stored in warehouses along the harbor. The population of Hormuz reflected its role as an international trading center. Arabic and Persian were widely spoken, yet travelers could also hear the languages of sailors from India, merchants from Central Asia, and traders from East Africa. Islam served as a common religious foundation for many of the merchants who passed through the city, though people of many cultures lived side by side within the bustling port. For Ibn Battuta, Hormuz revealed the immense scale of the maritime networks linking distant parts of the world. Here, the roads of the desert met the roads of the sea. Ships preparing to depart from the harbor would soon cross vast stretches of water, guided only by wind, stars, and the knowledge of experienced navigators. The traveler considered continuing directly across the sea toward India. But before doing so, he turned once more toward the lands of Arabia. His path would soon lead him back through familiar regions, and then onward to the powerful kingdoms of the Indian subcontinent. Return to Mecca and new roads. Before traveling further east, Ibn Battuta made another journey to Mecca. The pilgrimage routes remained active throughout the year, though the greatest gatherings occurred during the annual Hajj season. Travelers continued to arrive from distant lands, and the city remained a meeting place where news from across the Islamic world could be heard. During this second stay in Mecca, Ibn Battuta spent time studying with scholars and speaking with travelers who had come from regions he had not yet visited. Among them were merchants from the coasts of India who described the enormous cities of the subcontinent and the powerful rulers who governed them. Stories of India had circulated throughout the Islamic world for centuries. It was known as a land of great rivers, dense forests, and busy cities filled with merchants and artisans. For Ibn Battuta, these stories stirred his curiosity. The road that had begun as a pilgrimage was now becoming something much larger, a journey across the connected worlds of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Eventually, he decided to follow the sea routes toward India. To reach those lands, he would travel along the coasts of the Arabian Sea, joining sailors who followed the winds across the open ocean. The courtyards of Mecca at night. Imagine the sacred city of Mecca in the quiet hours after nightfall. The crowds of pilgrims who filled the courtyards during the day have slowly grown quieter. Lanterns glow softly along the pathways, casting warm pools of light across the stone. In shaded corners of the courtyard, travelers sit together after long journeys. Some speak quietly about the lands they have crossed to reach this place. Others rest against the cool stone walls, listening to the gentle movement of the night air. Above the city, the sky is calm and clear. The same stars that guided caravans across deserts now shine above the sacred city. For many travelers, this moment brings a sense of stillness. The long road that carried them across mountains, valleys, and deserts has finally led them here. And yet, even in this peaceful moment, the road continues. Beyond these courtyards lie countless other journeys waiting to begin. For some travelers, the pilgrimage marks the end of a great adventure. But for others, like the young traveler from Tangier, the horizon is still calling. And somewhere beyond the quiet city walls, the next road is already waiting. The cities of the Swahili coast. The eastern coast of Africa had long been connected to the wider world through maritime trade. Along this coastline stretched a series of prosperous port cities that formed part of the Swahili trading network. These cities included Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Kilwa, located along the shores of what are now Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. When Ibn Battuta arrived in Mogadishu, he found a bustling city that impressed him greatly. The harbor was filled with ships arriving from Arabia, Persia, and India. Traders unloaded cargo that included fine fabrics, spices, metal goods, and ceramics. The people of the city spoke Swahili, a language that had developed through centuries of interaction between African communities and merchants from the Arab world. Arabic words had become deeply woven into the language, reflecting the spread of Islam along the coast. Mosques stood beside narrow streets lined with houses built from coral stone. Further south, one of the wealthiest ports in East Africa, Kilwa owed its prosperity to trade in gold brought from the interior of Africa. Caravans carried this gold to the coast, where merchants exchanged it for goods arriving by sea. For Ibn Battuta, these coastal cities revealed how deeply connected the Indian Ocean world had already become. Goods and ideas traveled across the sea, just as they traveled along caravan roads across deserts. Yet despite the prosperity of these ports, the traveler did not remain long. His curiosity continued to pull him toward lands further east. And so he boarded another ship, this time heading toward one of the most powerful kingdoms of the medieval world. The sea routes to India. Ships departing the Arabian coast waited carefully for the arrival of the monsoon winds. These seasonal winds blew steadily across the ocean during certain months of the year, allowing vessels to travel great distances between Arabia, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Sailors had studied these wind patterns for generations. By timing their departures correctly, they could cross thousands of kilometers of open water with surprising reliability. The vessels used for these journeys were large wooden ships known as dhows. Their triangular sails allowed them to capture the wind efficiently, and their wide hulls carried cargo as well as passengers. When Ibn Battuta boarded one of these ships, he entered a new style of travel. Life at sea moved at a slower and quieter rhythm than travel on land. Days passed with the steady sound of wind filling the sails. Sailors climbed the rigging to adjust ropes while watching the horizon for signs of changing weather. Passengers often spent long hours sitting quietly on the deck, sharing stories or observing the vast ocean. At night, the sky opened into a remarkable display of stars. Without the lights of cities or towns, the constellations appeared bright and clear above the dark waters of the Indian Ocean. Experienced navigators used these stars as guides, steering the vessel along routes that had been followed for centuries. Gradually, the coastline of Arabia faded behind them. Ahead lay the shores of India, one of the richest and most complex regions of the medieval world. The western coast of India. When Ibn Battuta finally reached the shores of the Indian subcontinent, he encountered landscapes very different from the dry deserts he had crossed earlier in his journey. The western coast of India was lush and humid. Palm trees lined the beaches and rivers flowed down from the interior mountains toward the sea. Fields of rice and sugarcane spread across fertile plains where farmers worked beneath the tropical sun. Port cities along this coastline were thriving centers of trade. One of the most important was the city of Calicut, located on the Malabar coast of southwestern India. Calicut had become one of the busiest trading ports in the Indian Ocean. Ships arrived from Arabia, East Africa, Persia, and China, bringing merchants who exchanged goods in markets filled with color and movement. The region was famous for its spices, particularly black pepper, which was highly valued in distant markets across the Middle East and Europe. Local traders measured spices carefully and packed them into sacks that would soon be loaded onto ships heading westward across the ocean. The culture of the Malabar coast reflected centuries of international contact. Many of the local people followed Hindu religious traditions, worshipping in temples decorated with intricate carvings and colorful sculptures. At the same time, Muslim merchant communities had settled in the region through generations of trade. Mosques stood near the ports where Arab traders lived and conducted business. The languages spoken in the region were different from anything Ibn Battuta had heard before. The local population spoke Malayalam, while merchants from other regions communicated using Arabic, Persian, and other trade languages. For the traveler from Tangier, the experience must have felt both fascinating and disorienting. Everything, from the climate to the food and customs, differed from the lands of North Africa and the Middle East. Yet these coastal cities also demonstrated how the Indian Ocean had connected distant cultures through trade and travel. After exploring the ports of the western coast, Ibn Battuta eventually continued inland. His destination was one of the most powerful cities in Asia, the capital of the Delhi Sultanate. Arrival in the Kingdom of Delhi. When Ibn Battuta finally reached the lands of India, he encountered a world very different from any he had visited before. The climate was warmer and more humid than the deserts of Arabia or North Africa. Rivers flowed across broad plains where farmers cultivated rice, wheat, and sugarcane. The cities were large and lively, filled with people speaking many languages and practicing many traditions. Eventually, the traveler reached Delhi, the capital of the Delhi Sultanate. By the 14th century, Delhi had grown into one of the largest cities in the world. The city was surrounded by impressive defensive walls and contained grand palaces, mosques, gardens, and crowded markets. At the center of this kingdom ruled Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, an ambitious and unpredictable leader who governed a vast territory stretching across northern India. The court of the Sultan of Delhi. When Ibn Battuta reached Delhi, he entered one of the most powerful kingdoms of the medieval world. The city served as the capital of the Delhi Sultanate, a vast empire that ruled much of northern India during the 14th century. At its center stood the ruler Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The Sultan was known as a man of great intelligence and ambition. He was well educated, interested in philosophy and religion, and fascinated by scholars who traveled from distant lands. But he was also unpredictable. Some accounts describe him as generous and visionary, while others describe sudden decisions that confused even his closest advisors. The royal court of Delhi reflected the enormous diversity of the empire. Officials and scholars spoke Persian, the administrative language of the government. Arabic remained important for religious scholarship, while the ordinary people of the city spoke various regional languages, including early forms of Hindi. The population of Delhi itself was enormous. Markets stretched through wide districts of the city, selling cotton textiles, spices, jewelry, and carved ivory. Merchants from Central Asia arrived with horses and furs, while traders from the Indian Ocean brought pearls and rare woods. Mosques stood alongside temples, reflecting the mixture of Islamic and Hindu traditions that shaped the region. When Ibn Battuta arrived, his reputation as a scholar quickly reached the Sultan. He was appointed as a Qadi, a judge responsible for applying Islamic law in certain courts. For several years, he lived within the world of royal administration. Court ceremonies were elaborate affairs. Officials gathered in large halls decorated with carpets and silk banners, while ambassadors from distant regions presented gifts to the Sultan. Yet life in Delhi could also be dangerous. The Sultan's moods were known to change quickly, and political tensions within the court sometimes placed officials in uncertain positions. Eventually, Ibn Battuta began to seek an opportunity to leave. That opportunity came in an unexpected form. The Sultan appointed him to join a diplomatic mission to the distant Empire of China. The embassy to China. In the 14th century, diplomatic relations existed between several great powers of Asia. The Yuan dynasty of China, ruled by descendants of the Mongol Empire, maintained contact with other kingdoms across the continent. Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq decided to send an embassy to the Chinese court. Ibn Battuta was appointed as one of the envoys. The mission was intended to travel south across India, then sail across the Indian Ocean toward the ports of China. Carrying gifts and official letters, the embassy began its journey toward the western coast of India. At first, the journey proceeded smoothly, but events soon took an unexpected turn. Storms and shipwreck. When the embassy reached the port city where their ships were waiting, the travelers prepared to board vessels that would carry them across the ocean. But before Ibn Battuta could embark, disaster struck. One of the ships carrying many of the embassy's gifts was caught in a violent storm. The vessel was wrecked along the coast, and much of the cargo was lost. Another ship, the the one carrying many of the envoys, sailed away before Ibn Battuta was able to board. Suddenly, he found himself stranded. Returning to Delhi without completing the mission would have been dangerous. The Sultan might have viewed the failure as a sign of disobedience. So instead of returning to the capital, Ibn Battuta chose another path. He began traveling along the coasts of southern India. From there, he eventually boarded ships that carried him across the ocean. This unexpected turn in events led him to the Maldives, beginning a completely new stage of his journey. The islands of the Maldives. After spending time in India, Ibn Battuta continued traveling across the waters of the Indian Ocean, eventually reaching a chain of small islands scattered across warm tropical seas. These islands were the Maldives. Unlike the large cities and inland kingdoms he had visited earlier, the Maldives were made up of hundreds of tiny coral islands arranged in long rings across the ocean. Palm trees leaned over white sandy shores, and the surrounding waters shimmered in shades of blue and green. Life in the Maldives depended almost entirely on the sea. Fishing boats moved between the islands each morning, and the people relied heavily on fish, coconut, and rice brought by traders from India and Sri Lanka. One of the most valuable exports from the islands was something quite unusual. The Maldives produced cowrie shells, small smooth shells that were used as currency in many parts of the world, including regions of Africa and India. Merchants collected enormous quantities of these shells and carried them across the ocean, where they became an important part of trade systems far from the islands where they originated. The people of the Maldives had adopted Islam several centuries earlier, and mosques stood near the shorelines of many islands. Yet some local customs sometimes surprised travelers from other parts of the Islamic world. Because of the tropical climate, clothing was often lighter and more relaxed than in other Muslim societies. Women frequently moved freely through villages and markets, participating actively in daily life. The language spoken by the islanders was Divehi, a language related to those spoken in parts of Sri Lanka and southern India. Ibn Battuta remained in the Maldives for some time, and because of his training in Islamic law, he was eventually appointed as a judge within the island community. But life on small islands could feel quiet compared with the bustling cities he had grown used to. Before long, the traveler once again felt the pull of the road, or in this case, the sea. His next destination would take him to a place surrounded by legend. The islands of the Indian Ocean. Picture a small island resting quietly in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Palm trees sway gently in the night breeze. Their leaves waves whisper softly as the wind moves through them. Beyond the shore, the sea stretches outward into the darkness. Waves roll slowly onto the beach, their steady rhythm rising and falling like quiet breathing. The sky above the island is wide and filled with stars. Reflected in the calm surface of the water, the stars appear almost close enough to touch. In the distance, small boats drift quietly in sheltered lagoons. Their crews rest after long days sailing between islands, guided by the winds and currents of the ocean. Life here moves at a different pace. The rush of cities feels very far away. Instead, the days follow the gentle rhythm of the sea. Tides rise and fall. Winds shift with the seasons. Boats come and go along ancient trade routes that connect distant shores. For a traveler who has crossed deserts and cities, the quiet islands offer a moment of calm. A place where the endless movement of the journey slows for a while. But even here, the horizon stretches outward across the ocean. And beyond it, more roads are waiting. Sri Lanka and the sacred mountain. South of India lies the large island of Sri Lanka, known in earlier centuries by names such as Ceylon. When Ibn Battuta arrived there, he encountered a landscape of dense forests, rivers, and mountains rising sharply from the surrounding plains. The island had long been famous among travelers for its natural beauty and its religious traditions. At the center of the island stood a tall mountain known today as Adam's Peak. For centuries, people from several religious traditions had regarded this mountain as sacred. Muslims believed the mountain contained the footprint of Adam, the first human, who, according to tradition, had descended there after leaving paradise. Buddhists believed the footprint belonged to the Buddha, while Hindus associated the mountain with the god Shiva. Because of these beliefs, pilgrims from different faiths traveled to the mountain to climb its steep slopes and visit the shrine near the summit. Ibn Battuta joined one of these pilgrimages. The climb to the top was difficult, following narrow paths that wound through forests and rocky cliffs. Chains had been fastened to parts of the mountain to help travelers pull themselves upward along the steep sections. When pilgrims finally reached the summit, they were rewarded with extraordinary views across the island. From that height, the surrounding forests and rivers stretched toward the distant coastline, while clouds drifted slowly across the sky below. The journey left a lasting impression on the traveler. Yet the sea routes continued to beckon. Soon, he would sail further east into the island world of Southeast Asia. The kingdoms of Sumatra, continuing across the Indian Ocean Ibn Battuta eventually reached the island of Sumatra, located in what is now Indonesia. During the 14th century, Sumatra stood along some of the most important trade routes in Southeast Asia. Ships traveling between India and China often stopped there to exchange goods and replenish supplies. One of the prominent kingdoms of the region was Samudera Pasai, an early Muslim state that had developed through trade connections with merchants from the Middle East and India. When Ibn Battuta visited the region, he observed a society where Islam had recently taken root, blending with older cultural traditions that had existed across the islands for centuries. Mosques stood in port cities where merchants gathered, and local rulers welcomed Muslim travelers and scholars. The markets of Sumatra were rich with goods from across the region. Spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were among the most valuable commodities traded there. These spices were highly prized in distant lands, and merchants carried them across the oceans to markets in India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The languages spoken across the island belonged to the Malay linguistic family, forming the foundation of what would later develop into modern Indonesian and Malay. For Ibn Battuta, the island kingdoms of Southeast Asia revealed yet another example of how trade had connected distant cultures. Ships arriving from India and China carried not only goods, but also ideas, languages, and religious traditions. From these ports, the traveler prepared for one of the most distant destinations of his entire journey: the vast lands of China. The cities of China. When Ibn Battuta reached China in the mid-14th century, he entered one of the most advanced civilizations of the medieval world. The country was ruled by the Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols after their conquest of China in the previous century. Chinese cities impressed many foreign travelers because of their size and organization. One of the major ports he visited was Guangzhou, a city that had become a gateway for maritime trade between China and the wider world. The harbor was filled with ships arriving from Southeast Asia, India, and Arabia. Warehouses near the docks stored goods such as porcelain, silk, lacquerware, and finely crafted metal objects. Chinese artisans were famous for their skill. Porcelain vessels produced in workshops across the country were valued across the world for their smooth surfaces and elegant designs. Silk fabrics, woven in patterns of remarkable complexity, were traded along routes that had linked China with Central Asia and the Middle East for centuries. The language spoken by most people in these cities was Chinese, which sounded entirely different from the Arabic and Persian languages familiar to travelers from the Islamic world. Despite these differences, Muslim merchant communities had existed in Chinese ports for generations. Mosques had been built in certain neighborhoods where Muslim traders lived and practiced their religion. For Ibn Battuta, the cities of China represented one of the farthest edges of the world he had been able to reach. Yet after so many years traveling across continents and oceans, another thought slowly began to grow. The thought of returning home. Lanterns on a quiet river. Now imagine a quiet river flowing through a distant city in China. Night has settled over the rooftops, and the busy markets of the day have grown still. Along the riverbanks, lanterns hang from wooden buildings, their warm light reflecting softly in the dark water. Small boats drift slowly along the current. Their sails are lowered for the night, and the gentle movement of the river carries them quietly through the city. Somewhere nearby, the faint sound of a bell echoes from a temple. The air is calm, and the streets beyond the river grow quieter with each passing moment. Travelers walking through the city pause beside the water to watch the lanterns floating in the current. For centuries, rivers like this have carried merchants, scholars, and explorers across the landscapes of China. Their journeys linked distant regions together long before modern roads appeared. And tonight, the river continues its slow path through the city. The lanterns drift quietly on the water. And somewhere along the riverbank, a traveler pauses for a moment of rest before continuing the long road home. The long return to Morocco. After decades of travel, Ibn Battuta eventually began the long journey back towards North Africa. The route carried him once again across parts of the Middle East before he finally returned to the lands of his youth. Nearly 24 years had passed since he had first left Tangier as a young man intending only to visit Mecca. During that time, he had crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans. He had visited cities across Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Few travelers in history had covered such enormous distances. When he returned to Morocco, the familiar landscapes of North Africa must have appeared both comforting and strange after so many years abroad. Yet even then, the journey was not entirely finished. One final expedition awaited him. Across the Sahara to the Mali Empire. A few years after returning home, Ibn Battuta undertook another remarkable journey. This time, he traveled south across the Sahara Desert toward the powerful Mali Empire in West Africa. Crossing the Sahara required joining large caravans of camels that moved slowly between desert oases. These caravans transported goods between North Africa and the kingdoms of West Africa, including salt, gold, textiles, and manuscripts. After weeks crossing the vast desert, Ibn Battuta eventually reached the lands of the Mali Empire, one of the richest kingdoms of medieval Africa. The empire had grown wealthy through control of the gold trade, which connected West Africa with markets across the Mediterranean world. Cities such as Timbuktu and Gao had become important centers of commerce and learning. Islam had spread among the rulers and scholars of the region, and mosques and schools were established in the major cities. Yet the culture of the region also reflected older African traditions that shaped daily life in villages and communities across the empire. For the traveler from Tangier, this journey revealed yet another part of the interconnected medieval world. Trade routes across the Sahara linked West Africa with the Mediterranean, just as sea routes across the Indian Ocean connected Asia and the Middle East. Even in an age without modern transportation, the world was already tied together by networks of movement and exchange. The story is written. After decades of travel, the life of Ibn Battuta gradually began to grow quieter. The young scholar, who had once set out from Tangier with the simple intention of completing a pilgrimage, had crossed deserts, sailed across oceans, and visited lands far beyond anything he could have imagined at the beginning of his journey. He had seen the great cities of Cairo and Damascus, prayed in the sacred courtyards of Mecca, and walked through the marketplaces of Baghdad and Persia. He had traveled along the Swahili coast of East Africa, lived in the royal court of Delhi, climbed the sacred mountain of Sri Lanka, and sailed across the trading routes of Southeast Asia. He had even reached the distant cities of China, where cultures and traditions very different from his own had flourished for centuries. And after returning home to Morocco, he had crossed the Sahara Desert to witness the wealth and learning of the Mali Empire. Few travelers in history had seen so much of the world within a single lifetime. But as the years passed, the memories of those journeys could easily have faded into quiet conversation and personal reflection. Recognizing the remarkable nature of these experiences, the Marinid ruler of Morocco, Sultan Abu Inan Faris, encouraged Ibn Battuta to share the story of his travels so that they could be preserved. To record these memories, a learned scholar named Ibn Juzay was appointed to write down the traveler's account. Together they worked to transform decades of journeys into a written narrative. Ibn Battuta described the cities he had visited, the rulers he had met, and the landscapes he had crossed. He spoke about distant cultures, unusual customs, and the ways different societies organized their lives. Ibn Juzay carefully shaped these recollections into a structured text. The work they created became known as the Rihla, an Arabic word meaning the journey. Within its pages, readers could follow the path of a traveler who had crossed much of the known world. The Rihla did more than simply record distances and destinations. It captured moments of everyday life across many cultures. It described markets filled with goods carried from distant lands, scholars debating philosophy and law, and sailors navigating oceans guided only by the wind and the stars. Through the Rihla, the roads Ibn Battuta followed continued to travel through time. And even now, centuries later, those stories still allow us to glimpse the remarkable diversity and connection of the medieval world. The quiet end of the road. Every long journey eventually reaches a moment of stillness. For Ibn Battuta, the roads that had once stretched across deserts, mountains, and oceans slowly faded into memory. Yet, as his story shows, those distant lands were not as isolated as they might appear on a map. Even in the 14th century, the world was already connected through networks of travel and exchange. Caravans crossed the Sahara, ships sailed across the Indian Ocean, and pilgrims traveled to sacred cities from distant lands. Through these journeys, ideas and traditions flowed between societies. Languages mixed, religions spread, and knowledge traveled from one generation to the next. The medieval world was not silent or disconnected. It was alive with movement. And travelers like Ibn Battuta were part of that great human story. And so the road grows quiet. The traveler rests. But the story of the journey continues, carried forward through memory, writing, and the enduring human desire to explore the world beyond the horizon. The road grows quiet. And now, as our journey through the world of Ibn Battuta slowly comes to an end, the road itself begins to grow quiet. The deserts, oceans, and distant cities we have visited tonight gradually fade into the soft distance of memory. The caravans that once crossed wide sands settle for the evening beneath quiet stars. Ships that traveled across warm oceans rest gently now in sheltered harbors. Markets that once echoed with voices and trade slowly grow still as night settles over the streets. Somewhere along a distant road, a traveler pauses beside a small fire, looking up at the same wide sky that has watched over travelers for thousands of years. The stars above remain patient and unchanged. They have guided sailors across oceans. They have illuminated desert caravans traveling beneath the quiet night. And they have watched countless journeys begin and end across the centuries. Perhaps, as you listen tonight, your own thoughts are beginning to drift gently, like travelers resting beside the road. The story of Ibn Battuta's journey may belong to another time, but the quiet curiosity that carried him across the world still feels familiar. It is the same curiosity that leads us to imagine distant places, to listen to stories, and to follow the calm rhythm of a journey through history. Now, the road grows still. The lanterns dim, and the traveler rests after a long and remarkable journey. So allow your mind to wander peacefully now, just as the traveler once wandered across deserts, seas, and distant lands. Let the quiet road slowly fade into the night. The distant cities and desert caravans drift gently away into the calm distance of memory. And beneath the same wide sky that has watched over travelers for centuries, the world grows still once more. And so the road grows quiet. The lanterns dim, and the traveler rests beneath the stars. Good night.